My name is Ruby Hart. On paper, I looked like the version of adulthood everyone expects at 27. Steady job, a tiny apartment I actually liked, a stubborn little plant I hadn't killed yet. Behind the polite resume and the Netflix habit was the reason I never had to panic about rent in the middle of the month. My grandfather had set up a trust when I was a kid. It was always the thing you half joked about at family gatherings. Ruby's set for life. I never paid much attention because, well, it was just part of the background hum of my life. I assumed it existed. I assumed it was safe. I assumed the people closest to me would protect it. That assumption ended at a family dinner. My grandfather, Arthur Hart, cleared his throat and said something like, "You know, Ruby, you turned 27 today. It's time you knew about the trust." He was the sort of man who said things that made the room go quiet. When he speaks, people listen. My parents, Maya and Thomas Hart, smiled in the way people do when they think the script is still under their control. I laughed because it felt like the right thing to do. Then Arthur laid out the numbers. $3.4 million. A trust created decades ago with my name on it. Funds that, if left intact, would have allowed me time and choices real people work their whole lives to buy. I remember the way the air sucked out of me as he explained. The trust existed, the trust was mine, and my parents had been siphoning it. They'd started taking money when I turned 25. Small withdrawals at first. Market fees, loans, family expenses. According to Arthur, those euphemisms added up fast. He listed things like a doctor reading off a chart, 2 Teslas purchased and registered in my parents' names, a kitchen renovation that made my childhood home look like a glossy design ad, a beachfront property in Malibu that had nothing to do with any familial need or emergency. Each item landed like a stone. The more he spoke, the more my mouth went dry. The betrayal didn't feel dramatic in the moment. It felt ordinary and efficient, like bills being sorted and folded into other bills until there was nothing left that looked like mine. There's a second type of hurt that comes from realizing someone you trusted planned this carefully. It wasn't chaotic theft. It was bookkeeping, spreadsheets, plausible deniability stitched into every line item. They didn't just take money. They rewrote the story of my future without asking. That night, the candles on my birthday cake guttered out against a quiet face I won't forget. The future I'd assumed was guaranteed had been spent on SUVs, marble counters, and a view they chose for themselves. So here I was, 27, collected family pleasantries on the surface, and an undermined life underneath. Stakes. My independence. My career plans. The simple dignity of making decisions about my own money. Stakes. Trust. Capital T. And what it means to belong to the people who gave you life and the people who turn that gift into their personal shopping fund. Arthur didn't fumble. The night after he dropped the numbers, he called his lawyer, who called a forensic accountant, who called me with a list of things I never knew existed. Subpoenas, asset freezes, tracing entries that read like a family grocery list, but with commas and zeros that hurt. It was methodical and, in a way, almost polite. If betrayal is an art, Arthur's approach was conservation. Restore what could be restored and leave nothing to chance. The first real sign that this was no longer just a family argument came when a tow truck showed up at dawn and took one of the Teslas away. I watched from my apartment window as the driver clipped a shiny black car with a label that made my parents' faces go white, seized. My phone buzzed with a terse message from Maya, "We can explain," and I considered the sentence for a moment like it was a flavor. I'd heard that sentence before from baristas who'd forgotten my name. It tasted even worse coming from people who'd spoken it across my childhood kitchen table. The forensic audit was a slow, unsentimental machine. Bank accounts were flagged, property titles were scrutinized. Purchase records were pulled and handed to people who could read them without the polite euphemisms my parents had used. Loans, family expenses. Those were replaced, on paper, with invoice numbers and purchase orders, and the cold arithmetic of ledger entries that meant theft, not creativity. Arthur led the charge with an old man grimness that felt like armor. He'd always been the family's moral accountant, and now he was balancing the books in public. Within a few months, the audit had nailed down roughly $2 million recoverable through seizures and forced sales. The Malibu place went to a quick forced listing, Glossy photos that had once been a secret indulgence were now thumbnails on a real estate auction site. The renovated kitchen, marble countertops, industrial-grade appliances that shouldered dust like guilt, was appraised and liquidated as part of restitution. Even sentimental items couldn't escape the paper trail when they'd been purchased on accounts tied back to the trust. It was surreal watching pieces of my parents' life be parceled out like evidence. What made this uglier than money was how casual my parents had been about it. They had become habituated to telling themselves stories that justified every withdrawal. We needed to fix the roof. You would have wanted this. There was no sudden monstrous reveal, just a slow accumulation of tiny justifications that, viewed together, were a plan. It's one thing to borrow from someone, and another to build a lifestyle on that borrowing while calling it love. Confrontations happened in small, sharp bites. There were dinners where plates slid around the table and nobody ate. There were afternoons with lawyers where Thomas would alternate between bluster and pleading with equal choreography. Maya cried in a way that felt performative, like a rain machine turned on to soften the lines of culpability. When I asked them point blank what they had thought I would do, the face they expected me to hold while they bought a house by the sea, their silence was the only honest answer. They hadn't imagined consequences. That was the worst part. Their arrogance wasn't just in taking the money. It was in assuming the rest of us would carry on pretending nothing changed. I don't have an appetite for melodrama, but I needed accountability. I thought about restitution, about civil suits, about the practical route of clawing back every dollar they still had. But there's a different kind of ledger, one that keeps score on trust, on responsibility, on whether rules mean anything when the people entrusted to follow them don't. That ledger mattered to me, so I made the choice that made my hands shake. Criminal charges. Felony financial fraud. Breach of fiduciary duty. The words felt clinical as they left my mouth in the prosecutor's office, and then brutally heavy when the implications landed. They could face up to 10 years. There was a frisson of private horror. I had to balance the desire for justice against the awful human knowledge that these were my parents, people who had raised me, who'd washed my scraped knees, who could still, in private, make me laugh at the dumb things they said. Choosing to press charges was less about revenge and more about refusing complicity. I wanted the record to say something clear. You don't get to rewrite someone's life because you prefer the view from another city. I wanted a system to judge a breach of legal duty the way my conscience already had. I wanted my name to carry more than inherited legend. I wanted it to stand for a line that couldn't be crossed without consequences. When the district attorney's office took the case, it added a new, harsher cadence to everything. Grand jury subpoenas felt like storm clouds. My parents went from smug to frantic in a way that made me unexpectedly tired. Friends who had always been neutral now messaged with a new awkwardness. People I'd called cousin for years offered quiet support. Arthur called twice a day, his voice a metronome of resolve, less about vengeance and more about repair. There were nights when I lay awake and imagined every possible outcome. A courtroom drama where my parents admitted everything and were sentenced. A plea deal where they repaid some fraction and avoided prison. The inconceivable, where the system failed and everyone shrugged. The worst part was not knowing which of those endings would come true. The better part was knowing I had done something that aligned with my ethics. I had named the harm and tried to hold it to account. That decision split the family along a seam I couldn't sew back. Some relatives rallied to my side. Others called me cold. My parents called me cruel. I called a lawyer. The legal battle that followed was less cinematic than paperwork heavy. Depositions, motions, a forensic accountant testifying in language that sounded like arithmetic mercy. The state pushed hard. Fraud and breach of fiduciary duty are not small charges. And the possibility of prison hovered like an awful punctuation mark at the end of my parents' entitled sentence. It's strange to feel simultaneously resolute and guilty. I wasn't naive. Justice isn't always pure. People make mistakes. Families are complicated. But choosing to let the legal system decide felt like the only way to stop one generation from using another as a bank account. It felt necessary, even if the necessity hurt. The courtroom felt smaller than I'd imagined, carpeted, beige, fluorescent lights that refused to flatter anyone. What it lacked in drama, it made up for in finality. After weeks of hearings, appraisals, and an auction site that turned my parents' bad taste into public listings, the judge signed the order. Remaining assets liquidated, proceeds earmarked for restitution, and a court timetable laid out like a ledger. I watched as the clerk stamped the order and felt something in my chest unlatch. The Malibu house, photographed for showings by a realtor who said, with the kind of cheer reserved for people selling other people's problems, "It'll go fast," sold at auction. The Teslas were gone, their shiny frames traded for line items in an accounting spreadsheet. The kitchen appliances, the vintage watches, the art that had once been sold as tasteful additions, all passed through the same cold public process. Even the tiny things, family photos that had been used as collateral on a line of credit, were cataloged and either returned to me or sold, depending on their legal classification. Watching heirlooms advertised next to appliance specs was humiliating and oddly anticlimactic. Someone bid, someone paid, the bank processed a wire transfer, and then the balance column grew greener. The court ordered restitution to make up the shortfall. It wasn't instantaneous vindication. Restitution is a process, a slow drip of justice through bureaucracy, but it was official. The judge's language was careful and blunt. You cannot take another person's future for personal comfort. That sentence did more for me than any headline or family gossip ever could. My parents were given terms: liquidate, repay, and under supervision. Words that felt like a fence being built around the part of my life they had trespassed on. There were no immediate fireworks, no dramatic jail doors slamming on some cinematic cue. Instead, there were bank transfers, payment plans, and mandated financial counseling they had to attend. They grumbled and negotiated like people bargaining at a flea market for something they'd once believed was theirs by default. At family gatherings afterward, those that still happened, Maya and Thomas were quieter, their conversations full of the economy of people who'd been taught by consequence. It was small, and maybe it was all I should have expected. Restitution doesn't rewrite history, it just tries to correct the ledger. For me, reclaiming the money was only part of the story. The real work was unlearning the permission structure that had allowed them to see me as an ATM and not a person. With the recovered funds, I opened accounts in my name. Simple, boring checking and savings that felt like a small, sensible rebellion. I met with a financial planner who used fewer euphemisms and more spreadsheets. I invested, slowly, in things that were practical: an emergency fund, a modest investment portfolio, a place that I could call mine without worrying whether someone else had the deed for my life. Therapy helped. So did the deliciously mundane routine of paying my own bills on time and learning how satisfying it is to decide what to buy without needing permission. I went back to work with a new clarity. My job was still important because it mattered to me, not because it paid for the roof over someone else's beachfront view. I reconnected with friends who stuck around and politely eased out of relationships with those who'd always been performatively supportive when it was convenient. The poetic part, if there has to be one, wasn't a courtroom speech or a public shaming. It was a small, ridiculous pleasure. Walking past the auction site one afternoon and seeing my parents' former life reduced to thumbnails, then stepping into a coffee shop and paying for my own latte without thinking twice. Justice, for me, arrived as a series of quiet moments rather than a single spectacle. There's a moral that smells faintly of lawn mowing and responsibility. King of the Hill style, quiet and obvious, as the world that actually works, not the one you narrate about. People are responsible for their choices, and sometimes the law is the mechanism that makes that responsibility undeniable. I don't celebrate my parents' fall. I celebrate the boundary I finally enforced. I didn't set out to punish them for the sake of punishment. I wanted to stop the pattern. In the end, I reclaimed what was mine. Not only dollars and cents, but agency. I bought a small place with sensible floors and one sunny window where my plant, still stubborn, gets enough light. I make plans that aren't footnotes in someone else's story. The money helped rebuild the practical scaffolding of my life, but the consequence built something quieter and more important. The knowledge that my future belongs to me, not to the people who once treated it like a shopping list. When family gatherings happen now, there's a different atmosphere. The jokes are thinner, the smiles more cautious. Sometimes my parents will look at me and their faces say things they can't make lawful again. I reply with the kind of short, accurate kindness that says, without melodrama, we're still here, and I am okay.